Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. Glad to see this wonderful crowd tonight. I'm Angela Greiling-Keene. I'm a member of the National Press Club Book and Author Committee and the White House correspondent for Bloomberg News for my day job. I'd like to welcome our guest this evening, Rod Nordland. Of course, we are all here to hear him talk about his book, The Lovers. Thank you for being here with us. The club, as most of you hopefully already know, is the world's leading professional organization for journalists. For more information about the National Press Club, you can visit our website at www.press.org. And you can donate to programs offered through the National Press Club Journalism Institute at press.org/institute. So now I will turn the microphone over to National Press Club President Tommy Burr. Tommy is the Washington correspondent for the Salt Lake Tribune, and he'll be our moderator tonight.
Thank you, Angela. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I'd especially like to thank our guests from the New York Times Washington Bureau, as well as the World Affairs Council, D.C., for their outstanding support of tonight's event. Welcome, and thanks to all of you. We're honored tonight to have Mr. Rod Nordland, a National Press Club member. Let's start with that. Currently an international correspondent at large for the New York Times and the paper's former Kabul bureau chief. Mr. Nordland previously worked at Newsweek's chief foreign correspondent, has won many awards, including 2 George Polk Awards, half a dozen Overseas Press Club Awards, and shared a Pulitzer Prize for news. He was a finalist for a Pulitzer in international reporting. He was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, and has worked as a foreign correspondent in over 150 countries. Mr. Nordland's book, The Lovers, Afghanistan's Romeo and Juliet, is about a young Afghan couple from different religions and ethnic backgrounds who eloped and were chased across the country by the girl's family, who were trying to kill her in what is known as an honor killing. Beyond the love story and the couple's tragic circumstances, it's also a deeper look at women's rights, or lack of rights, in that part of the world. The book was just named as one of the top books of 2016 by People magazine, and has been reviewed by the Boston Globe and others, including a not-so-great piece by the Times Book Review. We have a lot to discuss tonight, but let's get started with a few basics. Mr. Nordland, could you give our audience a bit of a background here of when you first met the couple, Ali and Zakia, did I say your name correctly? Right. When you first wrote about them for the Times?
Yeah, I had been waiting for an opportunity to find a good honor killing, good journalistically, that I could write about, because mostly these things take place kind of in secrecy, and they're covered up, and it's very rare that we hear about them, and when we do hear about them, it's pretty rare that you get any access at all. And this was an opportunity that was offered to me by a women's activist, a women's ministry person, to actually interview the girl who's being held in a shelter to protect her from her family, as well as even the family, even her own family, and the boy she wanted to marry, which is the reason the family wanted to kill her. It was in Bamyan, so it was the middle of winter, but we went straight up and spent a couple days up there talking to them.
And after you met them, you wrote about them. You kept in touch. This wasn't a one-off story and you're done. Actually,
I didn't, because I didn't think there was going to be a follow-up unless she was taken out of the shelter and killed. And I sort of stayed in touch for that. And I kind of, nothing happened for a few weeks, and then she escaped. And when I found out about that, then it made it a much more interesting story, because we could get to both of them together. They escaped and eloped, and they were on the run. It was also pretty clear to me that they weren't going to get very far. They were young, they had very meager resources, and
they were illiterate as well.
They were illiterate, yeah. They were broke, and I think they started off running with $100 between them. And they were in a part of the country that's very sparsely populated, but it is populated. And it's a pretty hard place to hide, and I figured sooner or later they'd be caught, and I wanted to try to get to them before that happened.
And at one point, you may have crossed a line between writing about the subjects and helping them. And talk to us a little bit, this is where the National Press Club, about the discussion you had with yourself, and you write about in the book about the ethics of crossing the line of helping the subject of your book, a news subject, and how that affected you and how you still affects you.
Yeah, I mean, I did cross the line, and you know, I'm the first one to admit it. I got involved in their case. I at one point, you know, intervened and helped them escape the police. Police were after him on what were pretty clearly bogus charges of kidnapping, of him kidnapping his own wife, but still, they were criminal charges that were filed. And you know, that wasn't, you know, ethically, that probably wasn't something I should have stepped into. On the other hand, by pursuing them myself, I was bringing, you know, a great deal of attention to them. You know, we travel with a pretty big entourage in Afghanistan, and it's pretty hard for us to travel in a low-key way. And there was no doubt that my pursuing them might well have helped the police reach them. So at some point, I just felt like I really didn't have a choice. I could have hung around and waited for the police to catch them and covered that story, and that would have, you know, been a good story. But it would have been sort of the end of the story for the girl, or I could step in and intervene. I think it's a little like, you know, coming across a car accident, and you know, do you take pictures first? Do you give first aid first? And I think you just have to. There are times when you have to follow your humanity and get involved in the story. It's hopefully not a situation you're going to always find yourself in, but.
We as all journalists find ourselves in situations something like that. Have you faced any backlash? Have you heard any feedback from journalists or groups about that?
I haven't, actually. It's kind of mysterious. And, you know, there's some, like, New York Times executives here now. But, so maybe they're still thinking of doing something. I don't know. But at a certain point, I had to decide, am I going to tell my editor, as I should have done, what I was doing or not, and I decided not to because he would have had to tell me to stop or to pull me off the story. And he's never complained about it, actually. Once, you know, he was an early recipient of the manuscript, and he's never said anything to me about it, actually. And I kind of think he's relieved that I didn't, you know, push that decision onto him and make him the one responsible. That's my own little theory. I don't know. Maybe I'll be fired tomorrow.
Well, let's hope not. I would like to talk. You mentioned kind of the justice system in Afghanistan and the fact that the police actually at some point helped try to track this couple down. Talk about how that works there and how that is different than what we might see in a Western culture in the United States, for example.
Well, you know, the justice system there is kind of a sorry example of a huge amount of money spent with very little effect from the international community. I think the United States alone has spent $100 billion on rule of law programs in Afghanistan, and you still have judges who absolutely refuse to enforce laws, the fairly recent laws against that try to prevent violence against women. That make it a crime, for instance, to prevent somebody like Zakia from marrying the person she chose. And in fact, there was a law in 2009, the EVAL law that was instituted, made it a crime to commit rape for the first time. It was previously treated as adultery. There's still a lot of judges and a lot of courts in Afghanistan that will lodge a charge of adultery against the rape victim, as well as against the rapist, and just ignore the law. They'll even say in court sometimes, I don't believe in that law. I'm not gonna follow it.
Because of your writing, because of what you've reported in your book, this couple, Ali and Zakia, have become a little bit of a celebrity movement in Afghanistan. It seems, maybe in the larger Middle East. Do you feel that they have become like the poster couple for people who are younger, who want to marry for love versus arranged marriages?
I think they have, especially among really the younger generation, people in their early 20s. I mean, it's still the norm that families and fathers especially choose who people marry, and it's still the case that you know, the patriarchy and the mullahs preach against the idea of romantic love. But there is a younger generation that's starting to demand that right, and there are a lot of women's groups now reporting an increase in people coming to them and saying, "What are my rights? Can I, you know, I'm in love with this boy. Can I marry him?" And you know, that's just something that didn't happen before this case became kind of a sensation in Afghanistan as well as abroad.
But on the sensation point, it also has made them easier to find. They are currently still in Afghanistan, right?
Yes.
Are you in touch with them?
I'm in touch with them every week. Yeah, we have a system set up where we can't reach them in their house because there's no cell signal, but they go somewhere, or he does actually, and make a call, and if we don't hear from them, we send somebody to them. We have some friends in Bamiyan who'll go look after them. And mostly they stay in though. They're staying in his family's house and not going out at all because of the risks that they still face.
But you have, because of your reporting, there's some endangerment, and the fact that they've agreed to be photographed, for example, and to be part of these stories, they've endangered themselves a little bit. They're easier to find. People can look for them. Her father could find them.
Yeah, that's true, and it's a big disappointment to me that they're not out of the country by now, because I think, at least for the medium term, their only real solution is to get out of Afghanistan and get asylum in a third country. And it's actually astonishing to me that that hasn't happened, and I really expected it would, especially after this, the amount of coverage that the New York Times gave it and the kind of reaction it created. But they've been turned down by every Western embassy in Afghanistan for asylum. They've been told if they go to another country, if they flee to Europe like a lot of the other refugees do, or go to Pakistan or some other third country, they could apply for asylum.
But they have to leave the country. They have to leave Afghanistan.
They'd have to leave Afghanistan and take very great risks doing so.
And they did at one point, I read in the book, they did leave for a little while, and in tragic circumstances.
They went to Tajikistan, and where the secret police very quickly picked them up and beat him up, robbed both of them, robbed them of everything they had, even like touched her person, to rip jewelry off and so on. And which was, a very offensive thing to do to an Afghan woman, and infuriated him, and he tried to stop it, and then he got beaten up, and then they summarily deported him from the country, and they were kind of traumatized by that. And then at that point, Zakia was already 6 months pregnant, and at that point they decided they weren't going to do anything until after the baby was born, which was about a year and 3 months ago. And they went back to Afghanistan. But once the baby was born, then when they saw all these other people fleeing to Europe, they just were nervous about what would happen if they fled the same way, and something happened to their daughter, like it has happened to so many people trying to cross the Aegean. Somebody actually showed them a photograph of Aylan Kurdi, the little toddler washed up on the beach in Turkey, and they immediately kind of related that to their own child and decided, I think wisely actually, not to take those risks. And they've asked, and a lot of their advocates have asked too, if they have such a good case for asylum, why can't somebody extend that privilege to them, in Afghanistan, so they could leave without making a crapshoot out of their lives.
And staying there, and in fact, that goes to a question may lead to, maybe you want to read a passage in a minute, but the subtitle of the book is Afghanistan's Romeo and Juliet. We all know Shakespeare. That there's a tragic ending noted in that kind of title. Romeo and Juliet killed themselves at the end. Do you foresee such a more tragic ending to the story?
I hope not. I mean, I think there are a lot of solutions and a lot of possibilities. And actually, one of the encouraging things about this book and the book getting a fairly strong reception is that I think that might well do what newspaper articles weren't able to do, and inspire somebody or move some government to intervene in their case. And there have already been some feelers from diplomats that have kind of surprised me to see if there wasn't some way they could revisit their case.
This is a call to help in some ways.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. And then to fully answer your question from earlier about drawing attention to them, is true. They're very recognizable people now. And the last time they took a flight within Afghanistan, people came in and asked for their autographs. They were that well known, and of course they can't write, so it's kind of an ironic moment. But and that certainly has made it really hard for them to sustain staying in hiding and staying in their own country. But at the same time, when I found them, the advocates that were working with them didn't really think they were going to last much longer. And sooner or later, the judges were on the side of her family and sooner or later they would get them out of the shelter, get her out of the shelter and take her home. And she was convinced that her family would kill her before they even got her home. So they were kind of out of prospects. And this woman that contacted me in the first place felt that this is their only shot. You know, if we can draw enough notoriety and attention to their case, it could protect them. And I think to some degree that's been the case. But I really thought it would be over by now and they'd be out of the country. And you know, the Romeo and Juliet conceit kind of comes from a lot of the aspects of their relationship more than any hoped for ending. But
well, could you talk about that for a second? Maybe
yeah,
the passage
sure.
I read about the actual kind of balcony scene they have, similar to Shakespeare.
Yeah, sure.
Do you have a passage to read, maybe?
Mm-hmm. I think I have the right one. Let's see. So this is fairly on in the story. It's about how their courtship progressed. Initially, they had kind of grown up in adjoining villages, and they worked farm fields that were side by side. And so as children, they knew each other pretty much their whole lives. But once she reached puberty, by local custom, and she was separated from any men that she wasn't related to. So he never was allowed to see her after that officially. And he began conniving to find ways to see her, and eventually managed to smuggle cell phones to her. And for a long time, their courtship was done, like it is with lots of lovers in Afghanistan, actually, by cell phone. And eventually they progressed to, he would start sneaking over to her house in the early hours. And
part of this is being illiterate, he's not reading poetry.
He's not reading poetry, but he's reciting it. And an awful lot of the popular music in Afghanistan is inspired by Persian literature and Persian poetry. And a lot of the lyrics, even of popular music, are drawn from that. And so he would listen to these songs and memorize the lyrics and then recite them to her. And her father actually told me at one point, before he stopped talking to me, he accused Ali of seducing his daughter by telling her love stories, and that's sort of what happened actually, and she was pretty receptive to it. So this is as the relationship's getting pretty far along, and it's takes place late at night, and if I have glasses.
That'd be a good start. I could read it for you if you need me to.
I do have glasses somewhere. Yeah, here we go. Sorry. So, it was a particularly bitter winter and too cold during that February and March of 2013 for them to connive to meet in the lanes and the frozen fields during the day. Instead, he resorted to secretly visiting her home at night. In those days, he had taken a temporary laborer's job at a construction site, working a night shift that finished at midnight, and he would come over afterward when the lanes were deserted and the homes all dark. There was a walled vegetable garden outside the window to Zakia's room, where Ali would stand and call to her, as quietly as he possibly could, because she shared the room with the other girls and young boys of the family. And when she heard him, she would steal out of the house and climb to the flat roof, where she could look down into the garden and they could talk in whispers. The garden was barren in winter. About a dozen leafless apricot and apple trees lined the mud brick walls and surrounded long rows of tilled earth, now frozen hard. In one corner was a pair of ragged bamboo cages in which Zakia's father kept his partridges, used in the Afghan version of cockfighting, when he could afford them. A small brook had been diverted to enter a hole at the base of the garden wall, exiting through the opposite wall. Ali's 2 or 3 a.m. visits to the garden became regular occurrences, even on the coldest of nights. But at first, she would not come down to join him. It was dangerous for both of us, and it was so hard, he said. I would wait outside her house sometimes under a rainy sky, sometimes snowing, sometimes so cold she was concerned about me in the bad weather. I was always so frightened, she said, that he would be caught and so worried for him. On one particularly cold night, Ali stood in the garden, dripping wet from a frigid rain that had turned to icy snow, and recited famous lines from a poem by the 20th century Iranian poet Malik Oshwara Bahar, which have made their way into Afghan pop music. Love is a nightingale pouring out his heart in song for a rose, bearing patiently the stinging lacerations of her thorns. "I don't read and write, which is why I don't know any real poems by heart," said Ali. "But I love hearing love poems from others and listening to them read by singers." He knew that there was a world out there in which poetry existed independently of music, and he even knew a few verses from famous poems. Songs, however, he knew word for word. Memorizing the words from music was easy, and he did not need to read anything. Often he wasn't aware of the lyrics' roots in written poetry, not aware that when he recited lyrics without music, he was simply reciting poetry. They were all verses to him, arrows in his quiver. Zakia's favorite singer was Mir Maftoon, an Afghan from the mountainous northern province of Badakhshan, a place more remote than Bamiyan. Long before dawn one morning, early in the still wintry spring, Ali recited one of Maftoon's verses to her as she lay prone on the flat roof of her house, her chin on her folded hands, looking down over the edge. "Your two dark eyes are those of an Afghan, but the mercy of Islam is not in your heart. Outside your walls, I spent nights that became daylights. What kind of sleep is this that you never wake up?" Touched by the verses and by his suffering in the cold and freezing herself, Zakia finally came down to join him in the garden. And so their love story became a love affair, as Ali delicately put it. He would have stayed there in spite of the intense cold on those mornings, become the first call to prayer, the subh, which came long before any sign of dawn in these highlands. People would start stirring, going to the mosque to pray, or beginning early chores in animal pens and fields. He needed to be well away from her house by then. If someone loves someone, she should have that bravery to do whatever has to be done, Zakia said. For a long time, I was thinking about it and thinking about doing this, and why should I regret it now? That poem moved me. It increased my courage. Those days were so cold, and he was coming to meet me anyway, even though I told him not to come, because the weather was very cold. And he came anyway, and then he recited this poem. It was only a matter of time before they were caught. Ali slept in the same room with his older brother Ismatullah, and his nocturnal escapades did not escape notice. "What are you doing?" Ismatullah yelled at him. "I know what you're doing, and it's crazy." One night, Ali went out at 3 a.m. to meet her. Zakia, John, and I were in the garden, and we must have stayed too late because her mother saw us. She didn't recognize me because at night I would wear different clothes. I wore a hat at night, which I never did during the day. He ran for the far garden wall and scampered over it in a bound. "Who was out there with you?" Sabsa demanded of her daughter through the window. Zakia replied that she had woken up early to grind flour, and there was a farmer in the garden who begged for bread, so she went out to give him some. It was an unlikely story, and Sabsa did not believe her. "Come back inside, you dead father's daughter," Sabsa hissed at Zakia. Dead father's daughter. The curse cut deep. Of course her father was still alive, but few things were worse in Afghan society than the suggestion that a daughter might have no father to determine the rest of her life for her. Okay. Thanks.
So on the Romeo and Juliet part, do they know the story and do they know what happened in the story?
They didn't know that story actually, but they knew a lot of the Persian stories, and also often they have tragic endings too. The story of Sirhan and Farhad, or Zuleika and Yusuf, and some others that have really kind of tragic endings. and they thought of themselves as a story actually. Ali often would describe what was happening to them as a story, and they never expected to get very far. They often, early on, they were both often saying that if anything happened to the other one, they'd commit suicide. And I mean, I even asked them if they'd heard the Romeo and Juliet story, and they hadn't. But and then when they eloped, they expected to get caught. They didn't really think they could succeed in escaping for very long. But they felt if they just had a couple weeks together, that was worth taking that chance for.
Now, we'll go to questions in a minute, but I want to follow up on that because it seems like one of the last comments in the book of Zakia is her talking about if something horrible were to happen to them, it was worth the time they've spent together.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. They even said that when they were only 2 weeks, married for 2 weeks and expecting to be caught that day. I think they felt that way then even.
We're here in the comfort of the National Press Club, but have you heard from them about how they feel about the publicity of the book, about the publicity for them in Afghanistan, worldwide?
Yeah, we have talked about that a lot, and I've spent a lot of time trying to explain to them exactly what this is all about and what it is. It's a little hard for them to conceive of a book. I mean, I'm pretty sure the only book they've ever seen is the Quran, and I mean, in their village there aren't even television sets, so it's a little hard for them to conceive of that. But I think they have kind of come to an understanding of it, and they've kind of felt that all the tension has done them good, and it's kept them together, which was not the case before this came along. What they do understand is the idea of a movie about them, and there's been a lot of interest in that as well, and that's something that they're actually kind of excited about and look forward to.
Have you heard anything about that? We can break some news here about.
Yeah, no, there's been some interest, yeah, and they have a lawyer representing them, an entertainment lawyer, and they've been talking to a lot of Hollywood players. Yeah. That's actually been going on for a while, but now it's kind of going on officially. Now that the book is out, their lawyer has been working on a couple deals, and I think that's a long process. But I think it can't hurt. It can't hurt them.
Well, let's explore that one more thing. But first, let me say, if you have a question in the audience, there are 2 microphones on either side. You can please line up, and I'll get to as many questions as we can in the next little bit. But let's follow up on the idea that they have an entertainment lawyer. There's an idea of a movie being made, and yet they're living in fear of death in their village in Afghanistan. And at the moment, it seems like they have nowhere to go, no help.
Yeah, they're safe for the winter. I think that's her family has left the village, left Bamyan, and because it's kind of a remote place. The roads are really difficult. Some of them they're blocked for a lot of the winter, and flights are kind of intermittent. It'd be really hard for her family to get up there this winter, and so they're safe until spring. And I think by spring, they plan to make some move. But it is a pretty ironic thing, and the reason they have an entertainment lawyer is because I wanted to make sure they had a lawyer and who would represent their interest and
not be taken advantage of because of their.
Yeah, so it wouldn't look like I was trying to take advantage of them, and gave them some independent advice, and and that's somebody who can communicate with them separately and look after their interests, which maybe are not always going to be the same as my interests.
Makes sense. We have one question. I have plenty more as well. So, ma'am.
Pam, Constable from the Washington Post. My first question is a very simple one. She's Hazara?
She's a
Zakia.
Hazara?
She's a Tajik.
Tajik, and he's Hazara?
And he's a Hazara,
Okay.
yeah.
So I have 2 questions. One, do you think that the Western effort to help emancipate Afghan women has backfired? 2, have you been able to talk to any of the elders of these families and of these tribes who feel strongly about this issue? And have you gotten the sense, if you've been able to, that they strongly and emotionally believe that it is wrong for couples to marry for love and that they have to obey the elders' decisions, or that they too feel trapped, perhaps a little bit these days, in a system in which that is the norm? Do you sense any change at all in the culture itself, aside from young people talking on cell phones and trying to meet in gardens? Thanks.
Yeah, I think we've invested a huge amount in it, and a lot has been accomplished, and that can't be denied. There are girls' schools. There are millions of girls in school. There have been a lot of there are women in the workplace, and there are some. There are some rights for women that didn't exist before our efforts. But with all that, Afghan women are still worse off than women in any other country in the world by almost any metric that you apply. And whether it's longevity or maternal mortality or the ability to choose their own spouse. And I have talked to elders, I've talked to all the brothers and the father in Zakia's family, and to elders in their villages, and and to lots of other Afghans. And they do believe very strongly that people shouldn't marry for love. But they also believe very strongly that women are property and a commodity. And a big part of the reason that Zakia's father was so angry was that she was a pretty girl and she was worth a lot of money, and he was deprived of that money because he never got a bride price. And I mean, actually, Ali's family was willing to give him whatever bride price he asked, and they would have mortgaged their fields to do it. And when they eventually came around to his side, but he couldn't get past the ethnic and the religious differences.
Can I follow up on that by asking about, you make a point in your book talking about kind of what we in the United States called the freedom fighters in the 80s, pushing the communists out of Afghanistan. That there was some point to that that had to do with more of the chattel point, that had to do with controlling the women versus a communist society versus an Islamicist society. Do you want to talk about that first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I spent time in the 80s with Mujahideen, and it always struck me that the thing that really pissed them off about communism wasn't, communism per se. It wasn't the economic system. It was the rights that they extended to women. It was, the fact that during the communist period, for a time there were more women in work, more women in schools, more girls in schools, and women had more rights than they've ever had since, even in the current period. Women could divorce, their husbands during that time, and that infuriated the Mujahideen. And I think it was a much bigger driver of their attack on the communists and the Soviets. I mean, certainly invading their country was, a huge mistake, and rally people against them. But on the issue of communism, it wasn't the economic system they were upset about. It wasn't even the religious issue, because the communists in Afghanistan were never so stupid as to challenge Islam. They never did. And it was really all about the women.
Interesting. Rachel?
Rachel Oswald, Congressional Quarterly. Can you think of any instances where well-meaning Western NGOs trying to encourage more rights for women maybe undercut their argument by cultural faux pas or not understanding the region and the history enough? I've certainly heard of some of that happening when you had Western lawyers trying to educate Afghani elders about justice, and there are some accidents that happened that kind of invalidated their standing before some of the Afghans they were hoping to convince.
You're thinking of that case of the girl that was sold for, to pay the family debts, right?
Yeah, and others.
Yeah, I don't know many others. I think that case is pretty unique. Yeah, I think we've poured a lot of money into women's programs, but we haven't really spoken up very much about them, and I think that's been a mistake. I think we've been willing to, we've never been willing to kind of put our mouths where our money is in Afghanistan, and it felt that challenging traditional customs and even abusive traditional practices is somehow contravening Afghanistan's sovereignty, and that we should leave those issues alone. And sort of quietly work to try to empower women through programs and all. And I don't think you can have the two of them. I don't think you can't really change that society simply by throwing money at it. You need to kind of speak up for what you believe in, and we really haven't done that. I mean, the West in general, and the many donors and NGOs and everything else. It's very rare that anybody speaks out on these issues at all. Even the Afghan Human Rights Commission never spoke out on behalf of Zakia and Ali, and even in much worse cases where women have been killed and so on, it's pretty rare to hear any kind of criticism from the West.
If I could just follow up on that, what about the fear that to speak harshly about these practices, offensive as they are to the West, would only make Afghans hold on to them tighter because, what does the West know?
Well, then why should we spend so much money in that country if we're not going to accomplish anything with it? That's kind of my feeling.
How do you feel that Western press have covered these type of issues? Obviously not as depth maybe as you have. But how do you feel about how they've covered these issues? Is it a quick story and done, or do you feel like there's more in-depth reporting need to be focused on?
It is very, very hard to report because it's so hard to get access to the participants, and particularly to the women. It's extremely, in most cases you can't interview women in Afghanistan. It's
dangerous for them, obviously.
It's very dangerous for them, and it's almost impossible for you to do that as a man, and even women have a great deal of difficulty. But there has been a lot of good reporting and pretty exhaustive reporting on women's issues.
Ben?
Hi, I'm from Afghanistan, and I have been following the story, and I've been also following the comments from the Afghans on the story. It's very interesting. Some of them are saying, oh yeah, this is the reality, but some of them are saying, no, this is just a story to be kind of written in a book, because there needs to be a book on this. It's not that love doesn't happen in Afghanistan. And the part that a lot of Afghans comment about the book is that it's implying as if love never happens there, as if people never kind of fall in love and marry for love. It's as if parents are always and 100% kind of deciding for their kids who they should be marrying. And listening to you today here as well, you're kind of saying that, well, since the story broke out, a lot of young people are kind of saying that, oh, I want to love whoever I love. Do you think it's because it's always the negative stories that has to make its way in the Western media, and to say that, oh, this couple married for love won't make it to the headlines and to a book?
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't say in the book, and I don't believe that Afghans do not fall in love, and it happens an awful lot, and I do think that a lot of young people have been kind of emboldened by their story to try to act on that. An awful lot of, if you've heard like Night of the Lovers program on Tolo radio, is this program that it's kind of a call-in show where people call in to talk about their love affairs. It's just almost entire. I mean, they get hundreds of calls and thousands of reactions on Facebook when they post these stories, and they're almost always sad stories in which they fall in love, but then they end up in some arranged marriage that they didn't choose for themselves. And there's no doubt that people fall in love, but it's pretty uncommon that they are allowed to marry those people. It is true that some people, and there are some cases, and I talk about some in the book. In fact, Ali's father is one of them, who managed to secretly arrange, through their parents' help, to marry somebody they actually love. But I think that's still pretty rare. Even in educated, well-off families, it's fairly rare.
Almost all of my best friends married the people whom they loved. Their parents never decided for them. So it's a good story, and it becomes more complicated if one of the couples is kind of engaged to somebody else and they choose to marry the person they love. So that's like a more complicated case, because then that's when the family is endangered and creates a whole lot of other problems. And you probably know this very well as well. But people do, and it's not just in the recent years, for a long time, people do marry the person who they love.
I'm assuming you saw that in your travels in Afghanistan and the Middle East as well.
People marrying for love? I think it's pretty rare in Afghanistan, I have to say. I think it happens in very well-to-do families, but I think it's really an exception. And I know a lot of, even well-off educated Afghans whose marriages were arranged for them, and they just accepted what their families decided.
Thank you for your question, ma'am. Over here.
It's hard to follow a question like that. Mr. Nordland, thank you for coming tonight. I'm a professor at Georgetown University, and I have a background in human rights law and refugee work, so this is a fascinating story to me. My question to you was, now that you've written a book on this couple, you've interacted with them, you've been in touch, where do you see your relationship with them going? What's your next step?
I think I kind of have to continue my relationship with them until they're at least someplace where they're going to be safe. I don't really see any other choice, and I'll just continue to do that.
And what's their next step? Let's follow up on that too. I mean, you talked about their safe haven for the winter, entertainment lawyer, possible movie thing, but they've still got to have some way out.
They need a way out, yeah.
That involves money, it involves a visa.
Money's not a problem. There are a lot of donors who are willing to give them whatever money they need to resettle somewhere. And they would gladly step up and do that. But the problem is, they need, they've now come to a point where they just refuse to leave unless they can do it on, on a visa without having to risk their lives. So somebody has to give them a visa. And there are mechanisms for doing that in a lot of countries, but it takes kind of an exception to the normal practice. And so far, countries haven't been willing to do that.
Yeah, I think you wrote they satisfy like 4 of the 5
for conditions for asylum. That's right. They do.
But they have to touch down.
And nobody doubts that they would have an open and shut case, and their case is pretty well documented. So once they got to a place where they could apply for asylum, they would get it.
Do you feel the publicity has helped or will help their asylum, or do you think the publicity has drawn more attention when they could present their case and move through the system? But now all eyes are on this couple.
Yeah, I think, but that documents their case. If they ever got to where they could apply for asylum, that would make it very easy. And, I think it's pretty clear that without all the publicity, they would be dead by now. And so, on the other hand, all the publicity kind of keeps them kind of in a permanent state of risk as well. And
you do believe that they would be dead by now?
Yeah, she feels very strongly that that's the case, and I think she knows her family better than anybody else. But I've interviewed a lot of the menfolk in her family, and they make very little secret of the, what they would intend to do.
Over here.
The definition of love and the hierarchy of values in a society like Afghanistan, which is a very collective, very tribal society in which the wishes and desires and values of all of those in your circle matter tremendously. And the ostracism of living, imagine, alone in a place like Berlin or Paris or Ottawa for this couple, it's a kind of social death, which would weigh on them very heavily and could possibly even ruin their relationship. I feel terribly for them and for other couples like them, but I think societies have to evolve, and I worry about trying to force the issue, and I wonder how things like social media and Western charities and all of that act in trying to short circuit what might in fact possibly be a positive evolution in the way things are done. I have many Afghan friends who are Westernized, English-speaking professional people who very, very willingly and happily accepted their family's decisions about who they should marry. It's not because they're ignorant or illiterate, it's because it's the values that they share. It's a very tricky thing that's happening.
Can you respond to that?
And the protagonists are them, are they.
Can you respond to that? I mean, would it be better essentially for a natural over time transition than a forced in the social media world 24/7 we have maybe in a Western culture and kind of forcing our own cultures on another country?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're the ones that decided what they wanted to do. They decided they wanted to marry one another, and that wasn't something imposed on them from outside. And the social circle, they had to do that knowing that they would be abandoning that social circle. And, Zakia pretty much gave up everything she knew, everyone she knew, and she's extremely lonely from that as a result. But, saying, well, that's tough, we just have to let them evolve, you also have to say then, well, these people, it's okay if they're killed, and, that'll just be part of that process. The other thing, too, is that, the country's been at war for nearly 40 years, and that's distorted a lot of these things, and I think made them a lot worse. And progress that had been occurring was kind of stopped, and, the warlords and the kind of worst, most conservative elements of society, were in the ascendance and have made this situation a lot worse. And unless somebody's pushing back against that, I don't think it's going to change anytime very soon. I'm sorry, my voice is kind of disappearing on me, but.
We're going to be done with questions here in just a second, so we'll try to answer a couple more really quick if we can. Ma'am?
Sure. So my name is Nikita. I'm a student at Georgetown. And I guess my first question is, there are Afghan women's activists in Afghanistan. There's not just Western organizations. Women like Seema Samar, Sadiqi Basiri Salim have done amazing work. How much have those activists, Afghan women's activists, done to kind of mitigate the situation of forced marriage, honor killings, and all of these different, crimes against women, I guess?
I think they've done more than anybody. And in the case of Zakia and Ali, Women for Afghan Women was incredibly instrumental in protecting them and saving them, getting them out of jail, counseling them, giving them advice. And quite a few other groups that give counseling to couples and to try to stop practices like child marriages and so on. So they've been very active, but nearly all of those groups are very heavily financed by the West. And there are people that say, you see commentary. In fact, the person who reviewed my book for the New York Times attitude was that this is not our business and we should stay out of it. And if we did that, that all the women's groups in Afghanistan would pretty much have to shut down.
You're absolutely right. And I think another thing I was just going to comment is that Seema Samar, she's now head of the Ministry of Women's Affairs in Afghanistan, but for the past, I think it was 10 years, she was moving locations every 2 to 3 days because there were so many groups in Afghanistan that wanted to kill her. So that was my follow-up.
Good point.
Ma'am, the last audience question.
Do you think it's possible for progress for women in Afghanistan without a fundamental change in the application of religious doctrine or interpretations of religious doctrine to life, society, and government in the region?
It isn't religious doctrine. It's often presented as religious doctrine, but it's not. Honor killings and child marriages and the practice of vowed and selling girls to settle debts and so on. None of that is sanctioned by Islam. Next door in Iran and in a lot of other countries, these practices are prosecuted and criminalized. And you do have elements in Afghanistan who try to present these kind of abusive customary practices as sanctioned by Islam, but it's really wrong. And I think the more that people talk about that and emphasize that, the better things will go. And I think that's about all the voice I have left, actually.
Well, thank you. I do have one last final question for you. But before so, I'd like to present you with the National Press Club mug.
Cool.
We can get some hot tea and lemon for you, maybe. We'll fill it up with something to help so you can keep going. My last question is simply, would you like to respond to the New York Times book review about your own tome?
She's welcome to her opinion, I think that's enough said. I'm told by my publisher that you should never respond to a review, so I probably should leave it there.
Well, there you go. The book is The Lovers, Afghanistan's Romeo and Juliet, the true story of how they defied their families and escaped an honor killing. Mr. Rod Nordland, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.